2.5, multiplication of real numbers. We are going to be talking about multiplying positives and negative numbers. So, first thing you want to make sure you write down is the rules. 9 times negative 3. So, what you want to do is you want to think how many negatives are there. This is a positive, this is a negative. So, there's only one negative, odd. So, it's a positive times a negative, so I know that solution is going to be a negative. The question is what? Well, after that, you just multiply the absolute values, which is 9 times 3 is negative 27. The other way of thinking about it is, you remember how multiplication is repeated addition? So if I have the negative 3 repeated 9 times, like you owe me $3, you owe me $3 more, 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 you basically then owe me $27. Or if you think about a 3-yard loss in football happening 9 times, well, that means you've lost altogether 27 yards. So just another way to think about it. I think I'm going to switch pen colors. 8 times negative a half times negative a 6. Positive, negative, negative. So how many negatives do I have? 2, which is even, so that means my solution is going to be positive. Another way of doing it, if you're unsure at first, is you can say, well, what's 8 times negative a half? Well, positive times a negative is a negative, and 8 times a half, half of 8 is 4. And then what I could do is bring down everything else. So bring down a negative 6. And I could say then, going back to my rules, a negative times a negative is a positive. 4 times 6 is positive 24. Your choice on what order, it's all multiplication, so you can use the commutative property and multiply out of order. I could have done 8 times 6 is 48, and then half of that is 24, and then thought about, I have 2 negatives, so that makes it a positive. All right, moving on. Number 3, negative 3 to the 3rd power. The question is, how many negatives are there? This gets a little confusing. Here's what's happening. When you have negative 3 in the parentheses, it's saying all of negative 3 is being multiplied 3 times. So if I was to write this out, it would look like negative 3 multiplied by negative 3 multiplied by negative 3. So how many negatives do I have? 3 negatives. Odd or even? It's odd, so then it multiplies to a negative. So I already know my solution is a negative. And then what's 3 times 3 times 3? Very good. Negative 27. Okay? Let's go to number 4. I have a negative times a negative times a negative times a negative. What's the answer going to be? Positive or negative? 4 negatives is an even amount of negatives, so the answer is positive. So I can already tell you the answer will be a positive number. Now I can multiply out of order, or I could do 2 at a time. I could do a negative 2 times a negative a half, which equals a positive 1, right? Because half of 2 is 1. And then multiply that by a negative 3 times a negative 5, which equals a positive 15. And what is 1 times 15? Positive 15. Awesome. All right, let's try it with some variables. Here I have a negative 4 times a negative y, a negative times a negative, 2 negatives, so positive or negative. Correct, positive. And this will be a positive 4y. Okay? Here I have a positive times a negative times a negative times a negative. How many negatives do you see? 3. So that is an odd amount of negatives, so the solution will be a negative. One way I kind of think of it is every 2 negatives make a positive. So here's 2 negatives, that makes a positive. I'm left with an extra negative, so that's why it ends up negative. So definitely this solution is a negative, but then the question is what? Well, I have 5 multiplied by an x times an x times an x. So what's x times x times x? X times x is x squared times another x is x to the 3rd. So this is a negative and 5x to the 3rd. Number 7, negative 1 times negative p to the 2nd. Let's expand it. When in doubt, write it out. So this means -1 times, and then what's being raised to the second? Well, it's just negative p, because that's all that's in the parentheses. So that means it's negative p times negative p. So now that I've written it out, I can count how many negatives are. You may have gotten tricked if you count here, because you would see only 2 factors, but in reality there's actually 3 factors when you expand it with the exponent. So a negative times a negative times a negative, that's 3 negatives. Positive or negative is the solution. Correct, negative. So my answer would be negative. And then, well, p times p is p squared times 1 just keeps it as p squared. So the answer is going to be a negative and then p squared. Big confusion on this. This is a negative and then n to the 4th power. So what this means is a -1, in a sense, times n raised to the 4th power. So the question is, what's being raised to the 4th power? It is only the n. So if I was to expand this, this means -1 times n times n times n times n. So I only have actually 1 negative. That's an odd amount of negatives, so the answer is negative. And then if I have 1 times the n, that's just n. So how many times am I multiplying that n? To the 4th power. Okay, negative n to the 4th. Let's ask more questions about this. In fact, if you want to pause for a minute and write down a question, this is a tricky idea. Let's practice this some more tomorrow in class. All right, number 9. Whenever you're plugging in a value for a variable, so in this case, my x is equal to -7, you want to do an open parentheses for what the variable is. So when I rewrite this problem, I'm going to write 2 times negative, and I'm going to do an open parentheses for x times negative and an open parentheses for x. If that's hard for you to see, how about I do the x parentheses in purple. So see how it's still 2 and the negative and da. It's the same thing. And now let's substitute in what x is. X is -7. So it's a -7 and it's a -7. At this point I can start counting how many negatives. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 negatives, that means the solution's positive. But I know some people have some confusion with that. So think about a negative times a negative, right? That's a positive. And another negative times a negative, that's a positive. So what do I have? I have, in a sense, 2 times 7 times 7. Okay? We could do 2 times 7 is 49 and then times 7. Sorry, 2 times 7 is 14 and then times 7. Or I can do 7 times 7 is 49 and then times 2. Doesn't really matter. Let's try 2 times 7 is 14 and then multiply it by 7. And how I like to multiply this in my head is I do the distributive property. 7 times 10 is 70, and 7 times 4 is 28. So I had 70 and 28. Line it up in your brain and you should get a solution of 98. Okay? Number 10, again, we want to plug in the value for the variable.